So, when you hear the name David Goggins, what comes to mind? For most people, it's a guy who's basically superhuman, right? A Navy SEAL, an ultramarathoner, a man who seems to eat pain for breakfast. But what if I told you that the icon we see today wasn't built from strength? What if he was actually forged in profound weakness and suffering? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dig into.
Yeah, I mean, look at this. On one side, you have the legend, Navy SEAL, elite athlete, world record holder. But the real story, it starts on the other side. This is the story of an abused child, a bullied teenager who literally couldn't read, a guy who ended up in a dead-end job spraying for cockroaches. Seriously, the gap between these two people, it seems absolutely impossible to cross.
And that really brings us to the core question here, doesn't it? How on earth does someone go from being that completely broken person to a symbol of unbreakable human endurance? Well, the answer, as we're about to see, is found right in the middle of all that fire from his early life.
So, to really get who Goggins is, you have to understand the demons he was up against. I mean, his foundation wasn't built on anything solid. It was forged in the kind of trauma that's really designed to break a person, permanently.
You can just forget about a normal childhood. Seriously. From the time he was 6 years old, David Goggins' life was basically forced labor. He and his brother had to work every single night at their father's skating rink, Skateland. We're talking serving customers, cleaning toilets, all of it. And then they were supposed to just drag themselves to school the next morning, completely exhausted.
But being tired, that was nothing compared to the violence. His father, Trunis, was just brutally abusive. There's this one story where his mom showed just a hint of displeasure, and his father beat her so badly she had to call the police. But the cops, they just turned a blind eye. They left the whole family completely at his mercy.
Now, when he and his mom finally did manage to escape, it was like they just traded one hell for another. In their new town, Goggins became the target of just relentless racism. And I'm not talking about simple schoolyard bullying. No way. We're talking about teenagers pointing a pistol right at his head, asking what he was doing there. We're talking about him finding a drawing of himself with a noose and a death threat right in his school workbook.
And if that wasn't enough, layered on top of all of that was this repeated, brutal exposure to death. He was literally on a bus that ran over and killed a little kid. And then not long after that, his mom's fiancé, this guy who had finally brought some stability into their lives, was shot and killed. A 14-year-old Goggins was left standing in a crime scene, soaked in the blood of the man who was about to be a stepfather.
There's actually a clinical term for what was happening inside of him: toxic stress. This wasn't just a series of bad things happening. No, the built-up trauma was actually showing up physically and mentally. It's why he had a stutter, why he had this crushing anxiety, why he couldn't learn. He wasn't some problem child. His entire system was just completely overloaded.
So when you're facing a mound of trauma like that, what do? Well, Goggins' first instinct was to run, to just cheat his way through life. But eventually he hit a wall that forced him to finally stop running and actually look at himself.
And that wall? It was the military entrance exam, the ASVAB. He walks in there fully planning to cheat, just like he'd done his entire time in school. But then he realizes, oh no, everyone has a different test. He was completely on his own, and he failed, miserably. At the exact same time, his school tells him he's not going to graduate. He had totally run out of road.
This is what led him to create his very first real tool for change, what he calls the accountability mirror. It's pretty intense. Every single night, he'd shave his head and face, and he would force himself to have this brutally honest talk with the guy looking back at him. No excuses, no blaming anybody else. He'd just call out his own weaknesses out loud. And then he'd write his goals on Post-it notes and stick them right there on the mirror.
And you know what? It actually worked. By forcing himself to be that honest, he finally started to build real discipline. He was waking up at 5 a.m. to train, he figured out a way to teach himself how to study, and he passed his exams. He got into the Air Force. And you'd think, okay, story over, right? A clear win over his past?
But nope, the story doesn't end there, because mental toughness isn't some switch you can just flip on. Those old demons, they don't die that easily. And his were about to come roaring back in the toughest environment he'd ever faced. So he gets into this elite Air Force pararescue training, and he hits another wall, a big one: water. See, he'd never really learned to swim as a kid, and these water confidence drills, they triggered all his old anxiety, all that panic. His new discipline just started to crack under the pressure of this really deep-seated fear. Then, the Air Force kind of gave him an out. A blood test showed he had the sickle cell trait, which is a medical condition that could be risky in that kind of training. So they offered to pull him from the program. And he took the offer. But as you can see from this quote, he knew the real reason. On paper, it was medical, but deep down, he knew the truth. He quit on himself. He let the fear win.
And that failure just sent him into a complete downward spiral. But here's the thing. What looks like the end of the story is so often just the beginning. This wasn't just him hitting rock bottom. It was him laying the foundation for everything that was about to come next.
So what did that foundation look like? Well, he left the Air Force totally defeated. He started coping by binge eating, just letting his health go. He got a job working nights as a pest control guy, spraying for cockroaches in these filthy restaurants. He said he just felt completely numb inside. He had tasted his dream, but then he just retreated right back into that familiar fog of his own fear.
And this right here, this was the physical result of his mental state. 255 pounds. He wasn't that disciplined trainee anymore. He was right back to being that broken kid, only now he was also carrying the crushing weight of his own failure.
And that's actually where we're going to leave it for today, at his absolute lowest point. But it really forces us to ask a pretty powerful question, right? Goggins' story proves that rock bottom doesn't have to be a grave. It can be a foundation. So the real question he leaves for all of us is this. If you look at your own struggles, your own low points, what are you willing to build on top of them?